They thought they were locking up one man, but they had no idea they were shutting the door on their own future. At exactly 4:32 in the afternoon, the heavy security door inside the city jail swung open as a convoy of dark sport utility vehicles stopped outside the entrance in perfect formation. Men and women dressed in plain business suits stepped through the lobby with calm precision, each displaying the unmistakable confidence of people who did not need to raise their voices to command attention. Conversations faded. Correctional officers exchanged uncertain glances. Even the front desk supervisor slowly lowered a stack of paperwork as every eye followed the visitors across the polished floor. No one recognized the faces immediately, but everyone recognized the small gold credentials clipped to their belts. The letters printed across each badge seemed to drain the color from the room. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Leading the group was Supervisory Special Agent Laura Bennett, a woman whose expression remained steady despite the growing tension surrounding her. She stopped at the front counter, calmly placed an official folder on the desk, and spoke in a measured voice that echoed through the suddenly silent booking area. "We are here for Special Agent Daniel Carter." The correctional officer behind the counter frowned in confusion before glancing toward the booking log. There must be some mistake." Laura never looked away. "There is a mistake," she answered. "That is exactly why we are here." Within moments, phones began ringing across the building. Supervisors hurried into the hallway while patrol officers whispered to one another, trying to understand why the Federal Bureau of Investigation had arrived without warning. No one had expected the ordinary arrest made earlier that morning to attract federal attention, much less an entire response team. Inside a holding room only a short distance away, Daniel Carter sat quietly on a metal bench, his hands resting comfortably in his lap as though he had expected this moment all along. 42 years old, dressed in simple civilian clothing, he carried himself with remarkable patience. Instead of frustration, he had not demanded special treatment. He had not argued with anyone. He had not revealed everything he knew. His calm had confused nearly everyone who encountered him that day. Outside the holding area, Officer Ethan Brooks stood frozen as fragments of hurried conversations drifted through the hallway. Someone mentioned the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Someone else repeated the word special agent. Another officer quietly wondered whether this was connected to a larger investigation. Ethan felt a growing weight settle across his shoulders, although he still believed there had to be an explanation that would protect the decisions he had made. Laura Bennett finally reached the secured door leading toward the detention area. A corrections lieutenant unlocked it without speaking. She stepped inside, walked directly toward Daniel, and offered a respectful nod. "Sorry we took longer than expected," she said. Daniel stood, smiled faintly, and answered with the calm professionalism that had never left him. "You arrived when you needed to." Around them, every correctional officer remained completely silent. No one understood how an ordinary traffic stop had somehow become the center of a federal response involving one of the nation's most respected investigative agencies. They would soon discover that Daniel Carter had never been an ordinary prisoner. 6 hours earlier, he had simply been a man driving across town to meet someone who could expose one of the largest public corruption investigations the city had ever faced, and everything began with a single traffic stop that should have lasted less than 5 minutes. 6 hours earlier, the city looked no different from any other Thursday morning. Office workers filled the sidewalks with paper coffee cups in their hands, traffic lights cycled through another ordinary rush hour, and the steady rhythm of downtown life concealed stories no one else could see. Daniel Carter blended into that rhythm perfectly. At 42 years old, the black special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had spent nearly 2 decades learning that the best undercover appearance was the one nobody remembered. He drove a modest gray sedan with more miles than style, wore dark blue jeans, a simple charcoal jacket, and comfortable walking shoes that attracted no attention. There was nothing about him that suggested federal authority. That was exactly the point. Resting on the passenger seat was a plain manila folder containing handwritten notes that represented months of patient investigation into a public corruption case stretching across multiple city agencies. Hidden inside the center console, secured beneath routine personal belongings, was his official Federal Bureau of Investigation credential. It remained out of sight because revealing it too early could destroy everything he had worked to protect. His destination was a quiet public square less than 3 miles away, where a confidential source had finally agreed to speak after weeks of hesitation. The meeting had been carefully arranged. No electronic messages. No repeated locations. No predictable schedule. Every detail mattered because trust, once broken, rarely returned. Daniel stopped at a neighborhood coffee shop before continuing toward the meeting point. He ordered a black coffee, thanked the cashier with a warm smile, and stepped aside while another customer reached for sugar packets. An elderly veteran noticed the small American flag pin attached discreetly inside Daniel's jacket and offered a polite nod. Daniel returned the gesture with genuine respect before leaving the store. He believed kindness should never depend on whether someone knew your profession. Across town, Officer Ethan Brooks was beginning what he expected to be another routine patrol. At 34 years old, he had built a reputation for confidence and quick decisions. Supervisors appreciated his productivity, but some colleagues quietly believed he reached conclusions before gathering every fact. Ethan considered hesitation a weakness. In his experience, acting first often felt safer than questioning his instincts. After checking his body camera, radio, and patrol vehicle, he pulled onto the downtown streets with the familiar confidence of someone convinced he could recognize trouble the moment he saw it. He did not know that his shift was about to intersect with a federal investigation carrying consequences far beyond the city limits. Meanwhile, Daniel received a brief vibration from the secure device hidden in his jacket pocket. The message contained only 3 words. Source confirmed arriving. He glanced at the clock. Everything remained on schedule. Taking one final sip of coffee, he turned toward the meeting location, unaware that another pair of eyes had already noticed his aging sedan entering the district. Ethan spotted the vehicle while waiting at an intersection and watched it continue through slow morning traffic. Nothing about the driver violated any traffic law. Nothing suggested immediate danger. Yet something about the unfamiliar face in an area already connected to recent investigations drew Ethan's attention. Instead of continuing toward his assigned patrol route, he eased behind the gray sedan and began following it through the streets, believing he was about to prevent a problem. Neither man realized that within the next few minutes, one series of ordinary decisions would quietly place an entire federal operation on the edge of collapse. Officer Ethan Brooks stayed several car lengths behind the aging gray sedan as it moved through downtown traffic with complete consistency. There were no sudden turns, no reckless lane changes, and no signs that the driver was trying to avoid attention. Even so, Ethan continued watching, convincing himself that experience had taught him to notice details other officers often overlooked. When Daniel Carter signaled for a right turn a full block before the intersection, Ethan followed without hesitation. The quiet public square where Daniel planned to meet his confidential source was now less than 2 minutes away. Daniel glanced once at the dashboard clock, calculating every second. The source had spent months deciding whether to come forward, and trust depended on punctuality. Arriving late could be interpreted as carelessness. Arriving with police following him could end the conversation before it even began. Daniel checked his mirrors again and noticed the patrol vehicle for what felt like the 3rd consecutive intersection. He did not panic. Years of federal investigative work had taught him never to assume the worst too quickly. Sometimes a patrol officer simply traveled in the same direction. Sometimes coincidence looked suspicious. He continued driving normally, refusing to make any movement that might appear evasive. Behind him, Ethan interpreted that same calm behavior differently. In his mind, unusual composure suggested someone trying too hard to appear ordinary. He radioed dispatch, requesting a routine records inquiry using the sedan's license plate. The response came back within seconds. The vehicle was legally registered. No outstanding warrants. No stolen vehicle report. Valid insurance. Nothing in the system suggested criminal activity. For many officers, that information would have ended the encounter before it began. Ethan decided it only meant he should look more carefully. As Daniel approached another intersection, the traffic signal changed from green to yellow. he slowed smoothly and stopped well before the crosswalk. Ethan stopped behind him, studying the driver through the windshield. Daniel rested both hands on the steering wheel while waiting patiently for the light to change, completely unaware that every ordinary movement was being analyzed through someone else's assumptions. Across the street, a man wearing a dark baseball cap briefly looked toward Daniel's sedan before quietly walking away from a nearby bench. Daniel immediately recognized him as the confidential source. Their eyes met for only a fraction of a second before the man noticed the marked patrol vehicle behind the sedan. Without any visible expression, he turned, blended into the morning crowd, and disappeared between two office buildings. Daniel understood exactly what had happened. The meeting was over before it had even begun. Months of careful preparation had vanished in silence. He did not sigh or show frustration. Instead, he waited for the traffic light to turn green, hoping there might still be an opportunity to reconnect later. Before he could continue, red and blue emergency lights reflected across his rearview mirror. Ethan had activated the patrol vehicles overhead. Lights! Daniel immediately signaled, pulled safely toward the curb, shifted the transmission into park, lowered the driver's window, and placed both hands where they could be seen without being asked. His calm was deliberate, respectful, and practiced. Ethan stepped from his patrol vehicle with the confidence of someone convinced he was making the right decision. Daniel greeted him politely and waited for instructions, believing that a brief professional conversation would allow him to continue on his way. Neither man realized that this simple roadside stop had already changed the course of a federal investigation, and every decision made during the next few minutes would carry consequences reaching far beyond the quiet street where two strangers first faced one another. Daniel Carter kept both hands resting on the steering wheel as Officer Ethan Brooks approached the driver's window with measured confidence. The morning breeze carried the distant sounds of traffic, construction equipment, and pedestrians beginning another ordinary workday, creating a sharp contrast to the quiet tension building beside the gray sedan. Ethan greeted him in a professional tone before requesting his driver's license and vehicle registration. Daniel responded immediately, explaining that his wallet was in his jacket pocket and asking for permission before reaching for it. Ethan nodded, and Daniel moved slowly, handing over every requested document without hesitation. His driver's license was valid. His registration matched the vehicle. His insurance card was current. Nothing suggested deception or danger. Ethan studied each document carefully before looking back at Daniel. "Where are you headed this morning?" he asked. Daniel smiled politely. "I have a business meeting downtown." The answer was truthful, even if it revealed almost nothing. Ethan continued asking questions about the purpose of the meeting, the identity of the person Daniel planned to see, and why he had been driving through that particular neighborhood. Daniel remained respectful throughout the conversation. He understood that many routine traffic stops ended with simple conversations, and he had no interest in creating unnecessary conflict. At the same time, the confidential source he had been scheduled to meet depended upon absolute discretion. Revealing names or investigative details could compromise months of federal work and place innocent people at risk. "I am afraid I cannot discuss the individual I was meeting," Daniel answered calmly. "The matter is confidential." Ethan heard the word confidential and immediately interpreted it as avoidance rather than professional obligation. He asked whether Daniel worked for a private company, a law firm, or a security contractor. Daniel paused briefly before answering. "I work in public service." Once again, the statement was entirely accurate, but it offered no explanation that satisfied Ethan's growing suspicion. Dispatch confirmed once more that Daniel's identification was valid and that there were no outstanding warrants or criminal alerts connected to his name. Even so, Ethan believed the unusual conversation justified continuing the stop. Several passing drivers slowed slightly as they noticed the patrol vehicle parked along the curb, although most continued without paying much attention. Daniel glanced toward the public square less than 2 blocks away, realizing that every passing minute reduced the possibility of reconnecting with his confidential source. The opportunity that had taken months to arrange was quietly slipping away. Still, his expression remained composed. Years of federal service had taught him that patience often protected investigations better than emotion. Ethan requested permission to look inside the vehicle. Daniel respectfully declined, explaining that he preferred to preserve his legal rights unless there was a lawful basis for a search. His response remained courteous, without raising his voice or challenging the officer personally. Instead of reducing Ethan's concern, the refusal reinforced his belief that something important was being hidden. What Ethan could not know was that the plain sedan contained investigative materials unrelated to him but essential to an ongoing federal corruption case. Daniel considered identifying himself as a special agent, yet experience reminded him why. Undercover operations demanded restraint. Once a confidential investigation became public, witnesses disappeared, evidence changed hands, and carefully established trust could vanish overnight. He chose silence, believing professional procedure would eventually resolve the misunderstanding. Unfortunately, every minute that passed carried both men farther from a routine traffic stop and closer to a decision that neither of them would be able to undo. Officer Ethan Brooks stepped back from the driver's window and looked once more at the documents resting in his hand. Everything appeared legitimate, yet the conversation refused to fit the picture he had already formed in his mind. Daniel Carter remained seated with quiet patience, watching every passing second carry his investigation farther beyond reach. Ethan requested another records check through dispatch, asking whether there were any additional notes connected to Daniel's name or vehicle beyond the standard database. The answer returned exactly as before. Valid driver's license. Valid registration. Valid insurance. No warrants. No criminal history. No alerts requiring detention. For a brief moment, silence settled between the two men. It was the easiest opportunity of the morning to conclude the stop with a warning or simply allow Daniel to continue toward his destination. Instead, Ethan noticed the secure communication device clipped discreetly beneath Daniel's jacket when the fabric shifted slightly in the breeze. It was not unusual enough to identify by itself, but combined with Daniel's careful answers, Ethan convinced himself that he had uncovered another reason to keep asking questions. "What kind of public service requires confidential meetings?" he asked. Daniel answered with the same steady professionalism he had shown from the beginning. "The kind where protecting other people sometimes means saying less than you would like." Ethan frowned. To him, the answer sounded rehearsed rather than responsible. Daniel understood exactly how unusual the conversation must appear, yet revealing the truth would immediately compromise an operation involving multiple federal agencies and months of carefully documented evidence. Every confidential source depended upon one promise above all others: their identity would remain protected until the proper time. Daniel had honored that promise throughout his career, and he was not willing to abandon it now simply because the conversation had become uncomfortable. Several pedestrians slowed as they passed the patrol vehicle, quietly observing the unusually long traffic stop before continuing toward nearby office buildings. None of them realized that a meeting scheduled less than 2 blocks away had already collapsed. The confidential source had disappeared into the city, believing law enforcement attention meant the risk had become too great. Daniel knew there was no practical way to recover those lost moments. Information delayed could become information destroyed. Trust postponed could become trust permanently lost. Ethan asked Daniel to step out of the vehicle while additional questions were resolved. Daniel complied immediately without argument. Standing beside the gray sedan, he maintained a respectful posture, answering every direct question truthfully while carefully protecting classified details he was legally obligated to safeguard. His calm only deepened Ethan's certainty that something significant remained hidden. At nearly the same moment, inside the local Federal Bureau of Investigation field office, an operations analyst monitoring scheduled investigative check-ins noticed that Daniel had missed a mandatory encrypted status update. That alone did not trigger alarm, since meetings occasionally ran behind schedule. 5 minutes later, a second scheduled verification also went unanswered. The analyst notified Supervisory Special Agent Laura Bennett, who immediately reviewed the operation timeline. Daniel Carter had never missed 2 consecutive check-ins without prior notice. Laura quietly ordered the communications team to begin emergency location verification. Across town, Ethan made one more decision that felt routine to him but would soon reshape careers throughout the city. He informed Daniel that he would be transported to the station while the situation was sorted out. Daniel looked toward the quiet public square one final time before calmly nodding. He offered no resistance, no angry words, and no attempt to reveal the authority he carried. He simply understood that the consequences of this misunderstanding had already grown far larger than either man standing beside that ordinary grey sedan could yet imagine. Daniel Carter sat quietly inside the holding room as the afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the concrete floor outside the narrow observation window. Hours had passed since the traffic stop, yet his expression had barely changed. He had answered every procedural question truthfully within the limits of federal policy, signed the required paperwork without complaint, and patiently waited while local officers tried to determine why an otherwise ordinary citizen had attracted so much attention. He never mentioned his title. He never demanded special treatment. He believed that authority meant very little if it only existed to benefit the person carrying it. Meanwhile, inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office, the atmosphere had changed completely. Supervisory Special Agent Laura Bennett stood before a digital operations display reviewing every available communication record connected to Daniel's assignment. His secure device had stopped responding shortly after his scheduled meeting should have begun. The confidential source had also vanished from every established communication channel. A technical analyst completed an emergency location request and quietly looked toward Laura. "We found his last confirmed position." Laura stepped closer to the screen. The location marker remained completely still. It was not at the meeting point. It was not on the highway. It was centered directly over the city detention facility. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Daniel had spent nearly 20 years protecting investigations with remarkable discipline. If his signal remained inside a local jail, there were very few explanations that made sense. Laura immediately contacted the United States attorney assigned to the corruption investigation before authorizing an emergency response. Within minutes, secure phone calls connected federal supervisors, legal advisors, and senior investigators across multiple offices. Every conversation reached the same conclusion. Daniel Carter could not simply disappear during an active operation without immediate intervention. Back at the police department, Officer Ethan Brooks completed reports describing the encounter exactly as he remembered it. He remained convinced that extending the investigation had been a reasonable decision based upon the information available to him at the time. Several co-workers asked why the traffic stop had lasted so long, but Ethan simply answered that certain situations required patience. None of them challenged his explanation because no one yet understood the larger picture. As the afternoon continued, dispatch received an unexpected call requesting confirmation that Daniel Carter was being held inside the facility. The dispatcher verified the booking information without realizing who was asking. Only after ending the call did she notice the originating number belonged to a federal office in Washington. A quiet feeling of uncertainty spread through the communications center. Less than 15 minutes later, the first unmarked sport utility vehicles entered the city limits. They traveled without emergency lights, without sirens, and without unnecessary attention. Their purpose was not intimidation. Their purpose was clarity. Laura Bennett sat in the lead vehicle reviewing a thin folder containing Daniel's operational history, commendations, and current assignment. She already knew his reputation. Calm under pressure. Exceptional judgment. Absolute professionalism. If Daniel had chosen not to reveal his identity during the encounter, Laura trusted there had been a reason connected to protecting the investigation. As the convoy approached the detention facility, ordinary afternoon traffic continued around them, completely unaware that one misunderstanding was about to expose failures reaching far beyond a single traffic stop. Inside the holding room, Daniel quietly looked toward the hallway after hearing distant footsteps growing more frequent. He did not smile. He did not appear relieved. He simply understood that the truth had finally arrived, and once it entered the building, nothing inside that department would ever look quite the same again. The convoy rolled through the gates without urgency because no one inside those vehicles needed to prove authority by creating a spectacle. Every movement reflected discipline earned through years of federal service. The unmarked sport utility vehicle stopped in front of the detention facility, and Supervisory Special Agent Laura Bennett stepped onto the sidewalk carrying nothing more than a leather folder and her official credentials. Behind her, a dozen Federal Bureau of Investigation agents followed in quiet formation. Conversations inside the lobby stopped almost immediately as the front desk officer looked up in confusion. Laura approached the counter and placed her credentials on the polished surface with calm precision. "I am Supervisory Special Agent Laura Bennett," she said. "We are here regarding Special Agent Daniel Carter." The booking supervisor hesitated before opening the detention records on the computer. "He was brought in several hours ago after a traffic stop," he replied carefully. Laura did not raise her voice or display frustration. She simply asked one question. "Who authorized holding a federal agent assigned to an active public corruption investigation?" No one behind the counter had an answer. Word spread through the building faster than any radio transmission. Officers stepped into hallways, supervisors left their offices, and administrative staff quietly exchanged uncertain looks as the significance of Laura's question settled over the department. Officer Ethan Brooks arrived moments later after being asked to report to the booking area immediately. He entered the lobby expecting routine paperwork but stopped when he saw the federal team standing together. His eye settled on the credentials clipped to their jackets. Every badge carried the same unmistakable seal. Laura turned toward him with the same composed expression she had maintained since arriving. "Officer Brooks?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Were you the arresting officer?" Again he answered yes, still believing there must be some misunderstanding. "That could easily be explained." Laura opened the folder she had carried into the building and removed a photograph showing Daniel Carter standing beside senior federal officials during a recent award ceremony. She placed the photograph on the counter beside Daniel's official identification. "Special Agent Daniel Carter has spent the last 11 months leading a federally authorized corruption investigation involving multiple jurisdictions," she said evenly. "His confidential meeting this morning was part of that operation." Ethan stared at the identification without speaking. For the first time since the traffic stop, every unanswered question from the morning suddenly connected into a single undeniable truth. Daniel had never lied. He had answered every question carefully while protecting information he was legally obligated to keep confidential. Laura continued speaking with complete professionalism. "Our concern today is not embarrassment. Our concern is the damage caused to an active investigation and to the confidential source who left the meeting after observing prolonged law enforcement attention." The booking supervisor immediately ordered Daniel's release paperwork to be completed without delay. Minutes later, the secure door opened, and Daniel walked calmly into the hallway wearing the same quiet expression he had carried throughout the day. Laura gave him a respectful nod. "I apologize for the delay, Daniel." He smiled gently before answering, "You arrived as quickly as you could." Several local officers watched in complete silence as federal agents greeted Daniel not with excitement but with the quiet respect reserved for a trusted colleague. Ethan remained motionless, realizing that the man he had viewed through suspicion all morning had been protecting a mission far greater than himself. In that single moment, authority changed hands without a single raised voice, and the lesson carried more weight than any argument ever could. By early evening, the detention facility had become one of the quietest buildings in the city, not because there were fewer people inside, but because every conversation now carried the weight of consequences no one had anticipated that morning. Daniel Carter sat beside Supervisory Special Agent Laura Bennett in a private conference room while senior officials from the police department, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the United States Attorney's Office began reviewing the timeline minute by minute. No one rushed to conclusions. Every body camera recording, radio transmission, dispatch log, surveillance video, and written report was preserved exactly as it had been created. Daniel answered every question with the same calm professionalism that had defined his entire day. He never exaggerated what had happened, and he never suggested that anyone should be punished simply because the outcome had embarrassed the department. Instead, he focused on facts. He explained how the confidential source had abandoned the meeting after noticing the extended police attention, how months of patient investigative work had been placed at risk, and how rebuilding trust with reluctant witnesses could take far longer than collecting evidence. Chief Michael Reynolds of the City Police Department listened without interrupting. As each recording was reviewed, a pattern slowly emerged. The initial records check had revealed no violations. Additional database searches had produced no criminal history. Every opportunity to conclude the encounter lawfully had existed, yet assumptions had gradually replaced objective evidence. The concern inside the room shifted from one officer's decision to whether deeper training and supervision problems had contributed to what occurred. Daniel noticed the growing frustration on several faces and quietly spoke before anyone else could. "Accountability protects every honest officer," he said. "The goal is not to destroy public confidence. The goal is to strengthen it." His words changed the tone of the meeting. Instead of becoming a discussion driven by blame, it became a careful examination of responsibility and professional standards. Over the next several weeks, independent investigators completed an extensive review reaching beyond the single traffic stop. They examined complaint histories, supervisory practices, policy compliance, and documentation. Procedures. The investigation concluded that multiple procedural failures had allowed poor judgment to continue unchecked. 17 law enforcement certifications were ultimately revoked or permanently surrendered following individual administrative reviews involving separate findings and due process. At the same time, civil litigation connected to the disrupted federal operation, contractual delays, and related financial obligations resulted in losses and settlements exceeding $10 million for the city. The financial impact captured public attention, but those closest to the investigation understood that money was never the greatest loss. The disappearance of a trusted confidential source delayed a major public corruption case and forced investigators to rebuild relationships that had taken nearly a year to establish. During a press conference held several days later, reporters repeatedly asked Daniel whether he felt vindicated. He answered with quiet humility. "Justice is not measured by how many careers are damaged," he said. "Justice is measured by whether we learn enough to prevent the same mistake from happening again." His statement appeared on television broadcasts across the country. Many viewers expected anger. Instead, they witnessed restraint, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to the principles that had guided him long before anyone outside the Federal Bureau of Investigation knew his name. Even Officer Ethan Brooks watched the interview in complete silence, realizing that the strongest lesson from that extraordinary day had not come from authority, but from the remarkable discipline of a man who never allowed power to become more important than character. 3 months later, the headlines had faded, the television cameras had moved on, and the detention facility had returned to its familiar routine, but the lessons from that single morning continued to shape decisions throughout the city. New training programs emphasized evidence over assumption, communication over conclusion, and the responsibility every badge carried toward every person encountered. Inside the police academy classroom where experienced officers now shared real case studies with new recruits, one incident appeared repeatedly without dramatic language or sensational details. It was presented as a reminder that professionalism was measured not by how quickly authority was exercised, but by how carefully it was guided. Officer Ethan Brooks no longer wore a uniform. His departure from law enforcement had come quietly through established administrative procedures, leaving him with more time than he had ever expected to reflect on the choices that had changed his career. He often replayed the conversation beside the gray sedan in his mind, recognizing that every opportunity to slow down, verify facts, and question his own assumptions had been available. The hardest realization was not that he had encountered a Federal Bureau of Investigation special agent without knowing it. The hardest realization was that Daniel Carter deserved the same respect before anyone knew who he was. On a cool autumn afternoon, Ethan attended a public community forum focused on rebuilding trust between residents and law enforcement. He sat in the back row without introducing himself, listening as local leaders discussed accountability, transparency, and the importance of treating every individual with dignity. Near the end of the event, the moderator welcomed a guest speaker whose calm presence immediately drew the room's attention. Daniel Carter walked to the podium wearing another simple jacket instead of a suit, looking no different from the ordinary citizen many people had passed on the sidewalk without a second glance. He spoke quietly about service, responsibility, and the importance of protecting both justice and public confidence. He never mentioned his own experience. He never criticized a single individual by name. Instead, he reminded the audience that institutions become stronger whenever honest mistakes are acknowledged and corrected instead of hidden. After the meeting ended, Ethan waited until the room had nearly emptied before approaching Daniel. For several moments neither man spoke. Finally, Ethan looked directly at him and said, "I should have seen the person before I tried to define the situation. I cannot change that day, but I will carry its lesson for the rest of my life." Daniel listened without judgment before offering a small nod. "Growth begins the moment we become willing to examine ourselves with the same fairness we owe everyone else," he replied. The two men shook hands briefly before walking in different directions, each carrying a different future than the one they had imagined months earlier. Daniel returned to his work with the same quiet commitment that had guided his entire career, never seeking recognition for simply doing what he believed was right. As the evening sun settled behind the city skyline, one truth remained far more valuable than any headline, any title, or any badge. Authority may open doors, but character determines what happens after they are opened. Respect should never depend upon a uniform, a credential, or a position of power. It should begin the moment one human being chooses to see another with fairness, patience, and dignity. Because the strongest form of justice is not proving who holds the greatest authority. It is remembering that every person deserves to be treated with respect long before anyone learns who they really are.